Okay, well, Lisa Marchiano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, I want to welcome you guys to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited.
Yeah, what a special experience this is. I was really pleased when you reached out suggesting that we try to do something together. And I don't think I've ever had quite this, I don't think I've ever done a threesome.
Real crowd scene.
Yeah,
we hope
real,
it's fun.
Yeah, right, it should be. And so that's what we're doing here. And also haven't done one where this podcast is going to be on my show, Shrink Wrap Radio, and it's going to be on your show, This Jungian Life. What a great title that is, too, I must say, for what you guys are doing, This Jungian Life.
Dave came up with that very creatively when we were hashing around ways of packaging this for people.
Yeah.
But I think that the whole group of us really works synergistically. One of the things that we had noticed when we were going through training, the three of us, is that when the three of us would get together, we could just never stop talking. I mean, it would go on and on and on. And so when Lisa came forward with this great idea about what would it be like to have somebody be a fly on the wall when we're just jawing away about Jungian ideas, and would anybody be interested in that? And so we gave it a shot.
Yeah, yeah. What a great idea that was. So where do I want to go next here? So I guess since you started talking about your podcast, let's maybe Lisa, you could give us an overview of This Jungian Life. We've heard a little bit of the history of how it happened.
Yeah, well, as Joseph was saying, the three of us went through Jungian training together, and it was such a profound experience, really, to be able to share the integration of these ideas together, the three of us. And, you know, we studied for our exams and we did cases together, and it was a real kind of, you know, a deep friendship for one thing, but also an experience that helped us grow professionally as analysts. And we missed that. We missed having that opportunity to be involved in an endeavor, a joint endeavor together. And then I had actually been interviewed on a podcast a couple summers ago, and I thought, gee, this is really interesting. This is really kind of fun. I wonder what it would be like to have my own podcast. And I sort of thought about it for a little while and then mentioned it to Jeff and Joseph, and both of them immediately went, yes, let's do it. That was really great. So the concept of the show is we take about the first half of the show and we talk about really just about anything from a Jungian perspective. So for example, I don't know, we recently recorded an episode about regret, right? And so, you know, we talk about regret in a general way. We might try to link it to some archetypal material like a myth or a fairy tale. And we just sort of circumambulate it and come up with as many different ways of thinking about it as possible from a psychological perspective. And then the second half of the show, we always interpret a listener's dream. So we've got these wonderful listeners who submit dreams, and we pick them and we you know, share our thoughts about what the dream might mean. Now, of course, we can't really interpret the dream without the dreamer there, but we can have some ideas about it and kind of show the audience. It's sort of educational. You know, this is what's involved in thinking symbolically.
Yes.
Okay, that's a great introduction. Unfortunately, I'm hearing some feedback when I talk. And a cure for that would be if everybody has on earbuds or earphones. Is that possible?
Yeah, I just have to get something, but I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay. And in the meantime, would this be a good time for me to add some words?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that I think we do on the podcast, in addition to discussing a topic like loneliness or anxiety and a dream, is I think we are modeling, or I hope we're modeling for our listeners, how we think about something as much
Yes.
as it is what we think.
Right.
And that we build on each other's ideas. It's we keep on jumping off of each other's ideas to amplify the topic that we're discussing. So it's a nice model for a dialogue where we are continually building on what one another says. And sometimes we have different ideas, but it's an additive process of make the topic larger, make our dynamic larger. So it's a nice, I hope it's a nice model for an interactive process.
That's certainly how I experienced it as a listener. And it was great to, that's exactly how as I mentioned, I was talking to my wife about it a little bit and saying, what's really, because she was a little shocked. Well, how can they work on dreams? At first, she was kind of offended. How can they work on dreams if the person's not there to give their associations and so on? And I said, well, really, it's a chance for people to see how Jungians think about dreams.
Exactly. And we often will have a disclaimer, as Lisa just provided a few minutes ago, that of course we can't do everything at all without the dreamer present, but there are symbols, there are images that give us ideas about how we might be thinking in a session. For example, if a dreamer mentions a mirror, what's a mirror? What comes up for us around mirror? So there are universal aspects that we can be curious about. And people out there who are having dreams or talking about it with somebody who's not a therapist could at least make a beginning in much the same manner.
Yeah, well, our listeners will have a chance to experience that in just a bit because we've got some listener submitted dreams that we're going to be paying attention to. So that's kind of a good overview of this Jungian Life podcast, which is wonderful. I noticed that you started in 2018, so it's been about a year. You've got something like 38 or 39 up there, which is great, off to a running start. Are you doing it once a week? How do you decide when?
We get together. The podcasts load one at a time every week, but when we get together, we sit together and we do some now at a distance, but we will try to do 7 or 8 episodes over a 2-day period or something like that.
Oh, how efficient. That's great.
The gift of being extroverts.
And I noticed that you're all kind of midlife adults. And and I was having a little conversation with Joseph while we were waiting for the rest of you to show up. And he let me know that he had a background in Alexander work. And so how about you other two? What was your previous life? Lisa?
Let's see. Well, I had a couple of different careers before I decided to pursue becoming a Jungian analyst. But I worked in my 20s. I worked in the field of international humanitarian assistance. So I actually worked for a refugee organization in Bosnia for a couple of years in the 90s, and I worked in Washington on the policy side and in New York for a little while. And then I just got bitten, and I knew I wanted to try to pursue this. So I did go back. I think I must have, I went back and got an MSW in my early 30s, and then proceeded to do Jungian training. So.
And Deb, how about you?
Well, I too have had a couple of career incarnations. I started out as a special ed teacher working with adolescents, and then I switched over to working in program development and fundraising for a hospital and a couple of universities, Stanford and Carnegie Mellon. And then I ran into the classic sort of midlife wall difficulty, and decided that I would try everything to get out of it, including going into therapy with a Jungian, I know, heaven forfend, with a Jungian. And that put me in touch with my own desire to become a therapist myself. And like Lisa, I got bitten. I was in a Jungian seminar and a Jungian dream group, and so here I am on my, I guess, third career incarnation. And
Great.
I would add that Lisa and Joseph may be at midlife, but I think I've kind of moved beyond that. But
Well,
nevertheless,
you're a
I'm
good
still
company,
enlivened.
too.
Mhm.
Okay, well, that's a great background to have. Let me say something about Shrink Wrap Radio for your listeners.
Mhm.
Maybe be their first exposure to me. And I'm actually in my 14th year of this podcast. I got started in the first year of podcasting.
That's
So,
amazing.
so when I approached a friend or two saying, hey, would you like to do this thing with me? No, no, they didn't know what it was. They weren't interested, etc. And now we've gone to the place where for a long time it's in sort of promoting my podcast, with people. What's a podcast? Nobody knew for the longest period of time. And it's just now starting to really break wide into the culture because there's now a TV show in which the star of the show is a podcaster, a young African-American man. It's a delightful show. I think it's on CBS and it's called God Friended Me. Also, there was
Yes.
a major article in the New Yorker, which is one of my most important journals that I follow. And there was an article a lot about podcasting. So it's now becoming a thing for a much wider audience, which we can all celebrate and hope for.
Mhm.
So I started back in 2005. As I say, I'm in my 14th year and have done more than 700 episodes.
Wow.
And as a result of that, I recently received an award at Harvard University from the president of the American Psychological Association
Oh,
Great.
Wow.
for having
yeah.
been a psychological pioneer in the world of podcasting. So as I'm sure you can understand, I'm thrilled about that. And
Oh, of course.
Well, excited.
Congratulations.
thank you.
Yes.
I can't resist bragging about it every opportunity.
Well,
And
and we've been a fan of your podcast, so you've been a sort of mentor to us.
That's so good to hear. And so then, as you probably know, I kind of cover the waterfront in terms of
Yes.
a very broad conception of psychology.
Mhm.
But there's certain themes that I've hit on a lot. And Jungian psychology and dream work, both of those have been very big threads. And although I'm not a Jungian analyst, but certainly I've fantasized that, thought about it, but did not end up going down that path.
Oh, it's not too late.
I don't know. I
Absolutely.
think at some point, maybe the institutes look askance. Hey, this is a big investment for us. We want this person to be around for a while. Yeah, so that's basically it for the podcast. And so I think we probably should also talk a little bit about our background in terms of dreams. You've given us some hints. Maybe you want to say more. I'll start off and try to model it and try to do it without taking too much time. Having been a professor for a long time, that's a big challenge because we're holding forth. So I have a long-standing interest in both psychoanalytic thought and Jungian thought. The psychoanalytic came first because the doctoral program that I was in at the University of Michigan at that time was a very psychoanalytic program. I didn't know it. I just ended up there by fate. I rebelled against it in many ways and reached out to look at a lot of other approaches to psychology. So I've always been very kind of Catholic in my interests in the sense of being broad and as universal as I could be. And then when I started at Sonoma State University, where I taught, they had a humanistic psychology program, which really fit who I was much better. And one of the faculty there, one of my peers, was a Jungian, not an analyst, but very immersed in Jungian thought. And he had been running dream groups with students, and this is back in the early 70s, 1970, 71, 72. I ended up teaching a class, kind of borrowing that idea from him, and taught a class called Myth, Dream, and Symbol for maybe close to 20 years, both at Sonoma State University and during a 2-year stint at the University of New Hampshire. I've been in dream groups with peers and led dream groups, very much influenced by the International Association for the Study of Dreams, IASD, which I see some heads nodding. Montague Ullman at Maimonides Hospital years ago pioneered an approach called a projective group dream work, in which the approach is to kind of, well, recognize that even with tons of training, there's a lot of projection involved. You know, if I'm saying, here's what I get from your dream, it really makes sense, I think, to cushion it with, if this were my dream. So that's kind of part of that practice, which I try. And Jeremy Taylor is somebody who unfortunately passed away recently. And yeah, so that's probably the, that's how I got here in terms of a strong interest in dreams. And anything that you guys want to add in terms of, I don't know, you each have unique professional backgrounds. And if this whole session were all about you guys, which normally it would be, I would dig into that, because I would imagine that those previous careers in some ways inform your work now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that you draw upon it. And so I guess one question to ask you, to each comment on, is maybe what your unique slant is. We've got 3 people here, and yet you're not identical. And you all went through the same training, but you're not identical. And you probably don't pick up all the time on the exact same elements. So why don't you each speak a little bit? And Joe, you can kick things off. You've been quiet for a while.
Well, my early background was a training in theater. And then as I became aware of the vicissitudes of being a professional actor, I became an Alexander Technique teacher. And as an Alexander Technique teacher, there's a lot of attention to how the body responds to stimulus, and particularly the idea of fight or flight response and how that can distort a lot of the natural corrective instincts that we have. So when I began to do mental health work, first as a psychiatric social worker and then as an analyst, I feel that I'm particularly attuned to how people's bodies are speaking in the room. And that might be something that I hold very privately, or it might be something that I comment on. But I think that the body is talking in the middle of the analysis as well. I also find that because of the imaginative work of having been an actor, that there's a way in which I like to enter into the imaginal world with my clients and in some ways co-experience what's happening both in the room and even in the dream life. So as an extrovert, that's particularly easy for me to do, but it's different than I think my own analyst was when I was being analyzed.
Yeah, Deb and Lisa, I was talking to, Joseph was the first one in the room here, and immediately I said, were you an actor? Because his voice is so perfect. So it was no surprise to learn that. Lisa, you want to pick up the thread and talk about how your early work experience informs your work now?
Sure. I'm not so aware that my earlier work experience informs my work, but I can tell you that I think my upbringing did very much. My mother was very interested in Jung, actually, and she would sort of sit and read the collected works when me and my sister were at school. In fact, a lot of my copies of the collected works were her copies with her notes in the margin, which is kind of neat. And she really valued myth, and she valued dreams, and I remember talking to her about my dreams, and she communicated to me the value of the inner life. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I kind of came into adulthood with that. And I will say
Lucky.
that, yes, absolutely. I'm very grateful for it, actually.
Yeah.
And I will say that when I started, contemplating my career change, I listened to my dreams. I was writing my dreams down, and I didn't know what to do with them exactly, but I did know they were important. And I think somewhat like Joe, I work from an intuitive place. I think that's just sort of my strength. So when I'm listening to a client's dream material, I'm often in a kind of intuitive reverie, and I'll sort of see what the psyche wants to bring up and sort of share that. And it's a real collaborative process. But I absolutely believe in the importance of dream work and bringing that sort of unknown information into the room, something that the conscious mind isn't aware of.
Yeah.
And I know for sure that it can unstick people from stuck places, and it can move the growth process along more quickly. It can kind of quicken the pace of
Yeah.
transformation.
Yeah. Wonderful. I forgot to mention that I've kept a dream journal too, off and on for 30 years or more. So, yeah, Deb.
Well, I would say that my previous careers influenced me in the sense that they were all highly relational careers of
Mm-hmm.
connecting with people. And I learned, especially as a special ed teacher, that often the learning difficulties that were supposed to be the agenda were really not the main focus. And that if there was a relationship and a depth of understanding, that was really the groundwork from which a reading problem or a thinking and organization problem really needed to emerge. Um, for me, working with dreams is the introduction to the inner other that we all have. And we don't know that we have this connection to more of us and perhaps not us. But dreams provide an easily accessed nightly channel or portal through which we can make a connection that makes a huge difference to us. And for me, as a feeling type, extroverted feeling kind of person, I tend to go for what the affect in the dream images elicits in me and in the person who is in the room that I'm working with. And I think feeling is some of the place that we really need to get ourselves reacquainted with and reconnected with. I know for myself in therapy that one of the big surprises I had working with a Jungian, we were working with dreams, was the day when all of a sudden it really clicked of, oh my goodness, this is my dream. Something really happened in me in a felt way that gave me the sense of what Jung talks about of an inner companion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, there's so much more that we could say. I mean, as each of you speak, it sparks stuff in me, and I could go off. And but let's go ahead. And does this feel like a good time for us to jump into with
Sure.
one of the themes that was? And were the listeners from my audience or your audience, or a mix of the two?
Well, we don't know for sure. So I created a special link just for Shrink Wrap Radio, and I know you put it on your website, correct?
Yes.
And we also put it. I think we ran a Facebook post with it. So
Okay.
my guess is it's probably mostly your listeners, because I imagine that you probably have more listeners than we do. But
Not long.
but it's for this episode. This was a special collection of dreams just for this episode.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I did announce it in a monthly newsletter that I put out, I think maybe twice, and in a couple of episodes. I even announced it early. I was so excited that I said that you were going to be my guest last week. So I apologize to everybody. It's this week.
Okay.
Okay, so I defer to you guys. We're moving into your world here. You choose a dream and somebody will read it and then we'll see what happens.
Okay,
So
well,
I'd like to invite the listeners to really enter into this in the way that we do as analysts. So even though people have submitted the dreams and we've read them, we often like to read them slowly in the space and to track the kinds of images or feelings that the dream evokes, even though we don't personally know the dreamer. And that begins to become the thread of dialogue as we exemplify ways of dealing with symbols.
I even have a pen and a pad here just in case something comes up and I know I might forget it. Yeah.
Lisa, are you going to read the dream? Yeah.
sure. Okay, so this first dream is a 45-year-old woman who is an artist and a journalist. And here's the dream. I am in session with my female psychologist. I am telling her something and she does not know the answer or is unsure of it. So she gets out her black cell phone and makes a call to a mentor or superior, I assume. The next thing, we are standing on a spiral stairs. My psychologist is 1 or 2 steps higher than me. We are both around the middle. On top of the stairs, there is a Black woman, probably in her 60s, very smartly dressed in black. She seems serious but not stern, like someone with natural authority gravitas. She has a black cell phone, and I gather that she is the person my therapist called. She says the answer is a bluebird or a blue jay. Then I look down my hands and see I am holding a blue bird in them. And let's see. So we asked for a little bit of context, and this is what the dreamer said. She says, I'm not in therapy, so I have no therapist. My older children, 18 and 20, have left home, and we have had a few losses in our lives. I am married and feel like my life has been in transition for the past 5 years. And we always ask the dreamer what the main feelings were in the dream. And she says, it wasn't emotionally charged, mostly surprise to see the bird in my hands. And she mentions also, again, that she's not in therapy now. She's never had a Jungian therapy, but she is a fan of Marion Woodman's.
So when we're listening to a dream, there are often 2 stances we can take. One would be an objective stance, where the dreamer or the dream maker is commenting on actual figures in the person's life, or we can take a purely subjective stance, where everything in the dream is symbolic of an internal psychological process, often on multiple levels. Since we know that the dreamer does not have a psychologist and is not in therapy, it leads me to want to approach the dream as a purely internal and subjective process.
I think that's a good place to start.
And the beginning of the dream is often the situation, the internal situation or life situation as it is. And so the situation is, I'm in session with my female psychologist and telling her something she doesn't know the answer to.
Now, I want to comment on something that Deb said, which is important, which is quite different from, let's say, how Freudian dream analysis is done. Jung believed that dreams are not deceptive and they're not shrouding, that the dream maker is actually describing things exactly the way it needs to be described and is not withholding anything. So in the situation of being in a session with a psychologist, we can imagine that the dream environment is something that is a rarefied environment, that when people come to their psychologist, there's a prescribed expectation that the psychological life is going to be examined and is going to be put at the forefront.
So
I'm struck by a few things in this dream. One is the feminine seems to be something that runs right through the whole heart of the dream. And another is something about hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're in the middle.
They're on a spiral staircase, and there's gradations. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just throw those two things in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about the feminine. I mean, the dreamer's female, the psychologist is female, the supervisor's female. So if this were a fairy tale, it's like, well, look, everything, everything's on the feminine side here. So we note that, that there isn't a lot of masculine energy.
yes. Yeah. And to add to the hierarchical symbolism, when the therapist makes a call, it's to a mentor or superior, she assumes. And in session, we're going to someone who has, we hope and believe, more knowledge than we do. And the image of the spiral staircase is very, very evocative and mythological. Stairs and circulation and up and down, something like Jacob's ladder, ascending and descending.
I've often referred to the spiral in talking about the therapeutic process, that sometimes people will feel like, oh, I've worked on this issue already. Why do I have to deal with this issue again? And it seems to be the nature of our life path in many ways is a spiral. And
yes.
we come around to that place again, to that issue that we thought we had resolved or that keeps haunting us, but we're at a different level with it, hopefully at a higher level.
That's a great amplification, because I use that image all the time with people. I'll say, yeah, it's the same issue, but you're on a different, you're higher up the spiral. So yeah, that is quite an image.
And that's reflected in the succession of therapists, that there's a return to the idea of a therapeutic attitude in the psyche, but the first attitude is not adequately penetrating. And so there has to be another circle around to a deeper or more profound kind of attitude, and particularly that has a greater amount of authority. Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which, and we come across this all the time when we're talking to friends, that you might have 3 friends in a room and they're all giving advice. They might all be giving the same advice, but one friend just carries enough authority for the listener to believe them and actually have it make an impact on them.
Yeah.
So it's finding the voice inside of the psyche that the dreamer can actually be affected by versus dismissive of.
Mm-hmm. And there is that sense of the dream ego, the dreamer as she experiences herself in the dream, and then one up her therapist, psychologist, and then one up above that, this Black woman standing on the spiral staircase in the highest position. I'm curious too about how many times the word Black has occurred in this dream.
Yeah, there's the black cell phone. The woman is Black. She's dressed in black. So
yes, smartly dressed.
Mm-hmm. Dave, did you have thoughts about that?
Well, that was definitely one of the things that I noticed. And I guess when I think of Black, I think of the darks, of the underworld, I guess,
mm-hmm.
of the unconscious, of what's not known. And so in a sense, if this were my dream, it might be depicting an interest in the psychological attitude that Joseph was talking, psychological exploration, and a sense of maybe working my way up. And so I'm interested in the verticality that's in this dream.
Mm-hmm.
And actually the final image is like a punch in a way. It's like a one with this nice punch at the end, this bluebird. And I think of the bluebird of happiness, it's the first thing that popped into my mind. but then I'm thinking of the bird as, again, verticality. Birds fly.
Mhm.
Bird Jungian thought can symbolize the transcendent function,
Mhm.
spirituality. And I'm struck by it's in her own hands. She's looking to outside. I am looking to outside authority. I'm
Mhm.
looking for somebody who's older than I am and more studied more, who can give me the answer. But ultimately, at the end of the dream, the answer is in my own hands.
Her
Yes,
hand.
but the event in the dream is she apparently cannot see what's in her hand until another person names it, which tells us that there's a poverty of early mirroring in the psyche.
Hmm.
Because in the way that children have all kinds of potential, but if the parents don't verbalize it, don't mirror back to them what is observed, the
Yeah,
child can not know it about themselves.
yeah,
So is part of this kind of transitional place that she might be in, and we're all speculating, of course, that
Yeah.
there's something about the higher woman, the greater therapist, being able to speak a truth that then allows her to see what has been there. And I think as therapists, that's such an important part of what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the image of looking down. Of the rest of the previous part of the dream, in a way, has been a looking up to her own therapist, to the Black woman on the stairs, etc. And the lysis or ending of the dream is, I look down at my hands.
Mhm.
Um, and I would think too that these images of blackness, the cell phone, the dress, etc., um, are images of the attitude towards shadow. What you were saying, David, about um, the black as a standout feature and what's dark, as shadow is the unknown part of us, and we're often reluctant to engage it. But that's often where the treasure is. And that all this repeated imagery of black finally leads to a blue bird.
Yeah, I'm going to just throw in something a little different. First of all, just remind us that the therapist would be an inner therapist. So it might be
Yes.
an inner attitude of seeking healing, perhaps. So, and that would sort of track with what the dreamer said, that she's kind of been in a process of transformation. So she has access to some kind of inner healing authority, both the lower authority and the higher authority of the supervisor. And I'm interested in the black too. And of course, I'm also thinking, Jung was very interested in alchemy, and one of the alchemical stages is the nigredo, where there's sort of, decay, and it's kind of almost sort of a death image, and that's associated with blackness. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's a black cell phone, and the woman is dressed smartly in black. And so it almost feels a little bit more like, it's not quite fitting for me to say that it maybe is shadow or nigredo entirely, because it sounds more like some of our conscious associations with black is it's sophisticated,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Everybody
worldly.
in New York wears black, right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And
But
it's a
one of
positive relationship with shadow, is what I
Yeah.
am
Okay.
feeling about it.
It,
Mm-hmm.
but also, black alchemically is associated with Saturn, and that would align with the feeling of authority and
Yeah,
gravitas.
Oh, yes,
That
that's
the
great.
woman is a
that's
very
good.
Saturnine figure. I also have a personal feeling and a theory that as the ego brushes against the sequence of symbols in a dream, there is this kind of libidinal transfer
Uh-huh.
from the symbol into the ego state. So there's something about the Saturnine structuring gravitas of the woman is passed into the dreamer, which then allows something to constellate. And
Yeah.
as Deb, you were saying, there's
Mm-hmm.
something about the authority of carrying the bird in her hand. That some of that gravitas of having the bird in the hand versus two in the bush, of of constellating and making the invisible visible, which I think is very much associated with Saturn.
Well, one thing about the bird, the ending of this dream, is it's a surprise.
Yeah.
It's a very big surprise. And it is like, we might imagine that this dreamer is sort of looking for something, right? She's there in her therapist's office, and the therapist is looking for something. She doesn't have the answer. She has to go somewhere else and look for it. And then, there it is. And Joseph, as you said, it's like or maybe Deb, you said it, someone said the answer was sort of in her hands.
Yes.
And it's color. It's life and it's color.
Yes.
So out of this sort of black spiral environment, suddenly it's in my hands. It's colorful, which to me, and it is alive. It's not a dead bird. And it suggests to me the possibility of a spiritual direction, so that if I think of this as my dream, I might see it as calling me to raise my vision, to maybe seek the spiritual side of things.
What comes up for me is the beautiful image of the bird, and I agree with everything you've said, Dave. But the bird in her hands, and Joseph, your phrase of a bird in the hand and not two in the bush, that it's the conjunctio of something that is spiritual. Birds are often associated with spirituality, and something very concrete and down to earth, which is our hands, our agency, something we can get a grip on, something we can get a hold of. And that those two things have connected in this final dream image. It's really lovely.
Now, I'd like to also add a flip, a different edge to the lysis of the dream, because this is a woman whose children are 18 and 20 years old. So she's got a bit of an empty nest. And we know that the dream maker is always nudging the psyche forward teleologically to the next step, or what's the next blossoming opportunity for the soul. So if we apply what's called a naturalistic lens to the dream, if you literally were to look down and you had a bird in your hand, and it was a live bird, the next likely thing you would eventually do is you would have to let it go and watch it fly away. So if we take that feeling and then we look at her association that she's in a big transition, she's lost her role as, the mother hen with her babies, and she's holding on to this bird, and that suddenly that's been made visible to her. There is a moment of choice, and the dream isn't telling her what to do, but there is an implication that some point you're going to have to let go of that bird.
I'd forgotten about the context that she gave us, where she said, my older children, 18 and 20, have left home. And we've had a few losses in our lives. I am married, and I feel my life has been in transition for the past 5 years. That certainly underscores what you're saying. So I'm interested that, although she hasn't been in therapy, she's been reading Marion Woodman. Now, Marion Woodman is a Jungian analyst. Everybody may not be aware of that. Very powerful, well-known. And maybe we would do well to think about what Marion Woodman writes about.
Do you have a particular idea around this dream?
Marion Woodman, the work of hers that I'm familiar with is very, very much about feminine psychology. And the book that this dreamer references is The Pregnant Virgin. And there are a number of books that Marion Woodman has authored, particularly focused on women's growth and development.
So The Pregnant Virgin brings me back to the bluebird and the opening up of this life taking flight.
Yes. And that's such a good point, because sure, if you have a bird in your hands, it's going to fly, but that is taking wing and taking life. We say taking wing as a metaphor for where your own path and trajectory is, what lies ahead.
Yeah, this dream really just feels like a gift,
Yes.
It feels like a gift. Something's been given to this dreamer.
Yeah, Jung talks about big dreams, and we could maybe get into that a little bit. And I've had a few in my life that, to me, just had that ineffable feeling like they didn't really want to be analyzed. It was like a gift, just like this marvelous gift. And if this were my dream, I think I might very well experience it as a big dream, with that wonderful gift at the end of this colorful bluebird, and all the potential that suggests.
Yeah.
I go back to the feeling, and I have the same feeling that you do, Dave, of what a lovely dream, and it's a gift. And I'm thinking about the dreamer saying that she didn't feel particularly emotionally charged, but surprised. And I'm hoping, if she listens, as I believe she will, to this podcast, that this may deepen her appreciation for what a lovely dream image she has been granted.
Yeah. That might be a good wrap-up line, so that we would have time to move on to another dream.
Another one?
Let's go
off prematurely.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Who wants to read the next one?
I will read it. This is the dream of a 54-year-old woman who says she has very varied kinds of work. Here's the dream. I was hiking in the mountain, up and down a valley, and kept running into bears. I made it back to my cabin, and the bears were in my yard and in my house. They were in my daughter's room, and she was small. I approached to see what might have happened, for the bear seemed to be sitting with her in a play area. And then I awoke. And what she provides for us in the way of context is that the bears were protective mothers, or they consumed her. The dream repeated itself. My daughter is a grown woman. I think I was reviewing my situation as a single mom and how dependent I was on my mother, with whom I have a bad relationship because she's overbearing. Also, my daughter's other caretakers in daycare, and lack of family support, and shame and difficulty. A warning or awareness of what women can be in one's life.
I just noticed something as you read that, that I hadn't noticed before. Maybe this is the Freudian in me, but she's talking about bears, and then she uses the word overbearing.
Overbearing. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Great.
Beautiful.
I just want to lift up that she says that the feelings in the dream were terror, exhaustion, trying, strife, and unstableness, which actually was interesting to me because just as an image, lots of bears could evoke lots of different feelings, right? So it's important that this dreamer experienced this dream as sort of terrifying and distressing. Yeah.
Did anybody else?
I'm wondering how you all responded to the phrase, the bears were protective mothers, or they consumed her.
Mm-hmm.
They consumed her means to mean that the bears ate the children?
It is a little confusing. I think what I imagined when I read that was that this is a dream that has repeated itself, and that sometimes the bears seem protective, and at other times it seems like maybe they ate the daughter. Mm-hmm. Does that track with what other people understood?
Well, I think that she's capturing the paradox of symbols, that there's a positive kind of warming spiritual idea around the bear and bear medicine and shamanism, but then there's also a very, intense aspect of nature. Nature is red in tooth and claw, and kill or be killed. So it's all, I like that she has both of the qualities in her associations to bears.
Mm-hmm.
And did anybody else think about Goldilocks?
Yes.
Because the bear is there with the little girl sitting in a play area, and I of course thought of Goldilocks.
The play area, yeah. I thought the play area, that struck me, the play area. I felt like there's stuff to mine there, but I didn't go to Goldilocks.
Mm-hmm.
So
I just kind of tagged it.
the first thing that I go to with the dream is the ambivalence we have around wild animals and how close or how distant we are in terms of creating the right relationship to them. So the fact that she's perhaps had numerous dreams about bears, and that the unconscious is in this multiplicatio, this
Mm-hmm.
bears and bears
Right.
everywhere, that there's this relentless demand in the psyche that she come into a relationship with whatever bears represent in her psyche, and that fleeing from it is just not going to be tolerated by the psyche.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I noted was that the bear is potentially a powerful ally, but also dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I wrote Smother Mother. That was the first association. Ambivalent relationship is symbolized in the bear.
And bears are a very powerful mother image. We're always talking about mama bear. And you don't mess with mama bear's cubs, because you know that mama bear will be right after you.
Yeah, that's when bears are most dangerous, right? Is when they have cubs. That's when you say, don't come between a bear and her cub.
And she is wrestling with her ambivalent feelings, I imagine, about her own mother and the support she needed when she was a single mother. And yet, as you pointed out, Dave, her mother is overbearing. So there's this ambivalence perhaps around her mother image, or her mother complex, we might say.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a mother complex.
Yeah, and we might even imagine that the bear is sort of standing in for, is an image of this woman's mother complex, which won't leave her alone. I mean, she's hiking up and down. She keeps running into bears. She makes it back to her cabin. There are more bears there. It's sort of like she can't, and in a way that tracks with her biographical information, that it sounds like maybe she would have wanted to separate more from her mother as an adult, but couldn't because she needed her mother's help in raising her own child.
And the bear as a stand-in for the mother is really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Bears are not good choices as human mothers.
No.
So it comes into the idea of the archetypal compensation when there is a tremendous lack in the child. And this is an idea that Don Kalshad unpacks beautifully in his book, The Inner World of Trauma,
Mm-hmm.
that as a young child, if we have a tremendous deficit in the psychic growth, that the individual's soul, in one way or another, will call from the collective unconscious an archetypal patchwork to add into the psyche so that the child can continue to thrive in one fashion or another. But then as we become adults and the inner resources blossom, become more dynamic, that same patchwork of archetypal images becomes a problem. So if her way of moving through the world, or even raising her own children, is constantly mixed with bear mother, she may be dreaming about it because she's at the point in her life where she can begin to confront that and perhaps separate from it.
Mm-hmm.
That there are other ways of being a mother that are perhaps more refined and less instinctive.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of riff on that for a second, one of the things that strike me about bears is that they are oddly anthropomorphic, and there's a lot of fairy tales about people who turn into bears, or bears who turn into people. When they stand on their hind legs, they kind of look like people. But they're not actually super well related to humans. I mean, if you see a bear in the forest, if you see a grizzly in the forest, you might think, oh, it's so cute. But that it is not thinking, oh, there's a nice human, let's become friends. They're seeing you as potential dinner. So I think Joseph, this idea of this being an image of something that's archetypal, that's been kind of unmediated and therefore not humanized, that's just largely really instinctual, that it hasn't been the voltage hasn't been sort of stepped down to a useful kind of energy.
That's the feeling
Yes.
I get from
it's
this
too charged.
infestation of bears almost.
And I'm thinking too of reminding our listeners that these are inner images from her own internal world of being a mother in the dream and a daughter. So she's the mother going into her inner daughter's room, who is small, although in real life her daughter is grown.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on here about being mothered and what that was like. And in this dream, it's benign because they're sitting in a play area. But as you point out, playing with a bear is not an altogether safe situation. And then there's the dreamer as the mother going into her daughter's room. So it seems there is a lot going on here about mother, daughter, and bear.
Yeah, that's a good amplification, Deb, because we might imagine that this dream is speaking about her own kind of inner young one.
Yes.
Who needs mothering and has been kind of left to the bears.
Yes. Oh.
Right. We often, have this idea of, being raised by wolves, Romulus and Remus, or some child being raised by a wild animal. And we tend to romanticize that. But many of us are burdened with very primitive parents that have very poor skills at either making it through life or knowing how to raise a child. So I think there are generations of people that feel as if they've been raised by wild creatures. And admitting that to oneself is, I think, tremendously painful.
Mm-hmm.
So what the dream often does, which I so appreciate, is that dreams will speak the unspeakable. To be able to sit with a client and say, I have a feeling you're raising your children as if you're a bear. What do you think of that? What is that like for you? And what is that like for your children? And to be able to tolerate the way in which the unconscious might be confronting us with important information.
Yeah, a part of the dreamer that was left to play with bears, which I find my own reaction here is that it's very, very poignant.
Mm-hmm.
And that this dreamer's inner daughter has something to say.
Yeah. And, Dave, you mentioned the importance of it being in a play area. And I think, to follow up on Deb's comment, I mean, it is really poignant, right? Because the play area, I mean, we can sort of think of Winnicott, that play is this important liminal space. And where there's you have to feel a degree of safety in order to play. And that important psychological things can happen in that space. Because, in that feeling of safety, you have access to the imaginal and that sort of thing. But there's a bear in that space.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought about was the possibility of generational trauma. It sounds like it's caught in the middle.
Yeah.
And the generational thing going on here.
Yes.
And I don't remember why I put this. I wrote down the word shame, and now I don't even know what I was picking up on.
But I think...
she says, and much shame and difficulty. That's why. And somehow, she said, as part of the context, also other caretakers, daycare, and lack of family support, and much shame and difficulty. Somehow the word grabbed me somewhere.
But to be put in touch with the parts of ourselves that are primitive and perhaps even visible to other people before they're visible to ourselves is shameful, or at least, at the very least, humbling. And it sounds like that this is trying to break into her consciousness. So the ego probably is feeling rattled.
But one way or another, the bears are here. She cannot escape them, whether she's hiking or going back to the cabin or into her daughter's room. Something from Psyche is ready to emerge into a new kind of consciousness. And I always think that is essentially good news of look what's here that she's being called to, and is therefore, I would assume, ready to dialogue with and integrate, work with.
And I mean, bears, boy, that is an image of a big amount of psychic energy, right?
Yes.
So there's something here that's really alive and kicking.
Deb, I like your idea of her dialoguing with the bear,
Mm-hmm.
because, I remarked that the bear would be potentially a powerful ally. And so there are ways in which that bareness potentially is part of her, can work for her.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's worked against her. So I think in the process of some kind of dialogic process, she could be in contact with those two sides.
Yes.
And begin to own them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if that energy were could be in touch with ego, if ego could be in touch with that energy in a sort of constructive way, that would feel really different than being tired and terrified and weary.
Exactly, and having the feeling of a lack of family support and shame and difficulty. And this is a time when sometimes we suggest that the person can engage in some kind of active imagination with a big dream image of think about bears, journal about bears, read about bears. But keep that somehow in the forefront of awareness during waking life, of paying attention to the image and letting it wander around, maybe drawing bears or buying a little bear totem of some kind. But just stay in touch with that image as a way of continuing the dialogue and a connection with psyche.
That's a great suggestion, and I think gives maybe the dreamer out there a place to go and to work with it. I wonder if we could squeeze in one more dream here.
Sure.
Okay, Joseph, this one's yours to read.
Right. So we have a 51-year-old dreamer who is a translator and a private English teacher and has this dream. I'm running through dark, unknown desert-like terrain, falling down and getting up and running again, feeling danger behind. I'm short of breath, and I have to run up the steep hill, but I slip to the bottom every time without reaching the top. Though I have the feeling that if I do reach the top, I'll find an important answer. A bit of context from the dreamer is that they're suffering some health issues which are not terminal, but the dreamer's father has been diagnosed with lung cancer. And in the dream ego experiences anxiety, fear, exhaustion, and insecurity.
Well, what came right up for me immediately was the myth of Sisyphus.
Yes, me too. I wrote it down.
Sisyphus in Greek myth was forever pushing a big boulder up a mountain, and just as he neared the top, it would roll back down to the bottom of the mountain.
And Camus wrote about that myth, and it was part of the existential philosophy of the absurd, the absurdity of life, the sense of the absurd, and like a hamster on a treadmill. Yeah. So if this were my dream, I might ask myself, where am I feeling like a hamster on a treadmill?
Patterns in life. Although what I lean into Camus' idea in his writing, and I think the conclusion that many of the existentialists try to push us towards, is that even though the outer life may be iterative, and that we may feel that we're traversing the same terrain, that we are still responsible for making our lives meaningful, even in the midst of modern repetition. Yeah. And we cannot rely on our job, which we perhaps have to repeat over and over again for 20 years until we retire, or our spouses who we come home to year after year, day after day, to provide meaning for our lives.
Yeah, I appreciate that, adding that additional part about the responsibility to do something.
I am paying attention, as I often do, to the very beginning of the dream, because it usually gives an image of the situation, the inner psychic situation as it is. I am running through dark, unknown, desert-like terrain. So deserts are not usually particularly fruitful. It's dark, it's unknown. And the dreamer keeps repeating that he's running, falling down and getting up, running again. So I have this image of where is that happening in his life, and what is it about running versus walking?
Just to remind you, the dreamer is female.
Yeah, the dreamer's female.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a running.
Holds, yeah.
And I'm short of breath.
And the dream doesn't give us a context for why she's running. Is she running from, running towards, or like a lot of perhaps unfocused anxiety disorders, there's a running because there's just too much energy in the psyche, and there's that kind of panicked reaction.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting in this dream, which it reminds me in some sense of the first dream we started with today, is there is a sense that there is an answer to find. There's this, if I get to the top, I'll find an important answer.
And again, the answer is up, which again gives me a sense of that, if this were my dream, maybe I need to seek a spiritual answer.
Yes. Because that's often a space where spiritual answers are found, is up. Moses went up to the mountaintop, and ziggurats and pyramids go up. So I'm just building on your point, Dave, of that there is something up there at the top that could be very important.
It could be, but I'd like to bring in the Pat Berry's admonition, and Pat Berry is a well-known analyst, that she'll often teach that the ego's attitudes in the dream are the least reliable information in the dream. And the reason is the dream maker wants us to confront something we don't know. So often what the ego concludes in the dream environment is often known material. And I would even say that the whole dream in some ways is driven by the fantasy that there is something somewhere else that if only I could attain it, everything would be better. What could also be suggested in the dream is maybe stopping running is the answer. Maybe there's nothing at the top of the hill. And that's become a kind of iterative target and a chronic attitude that does not work, and that the dream maker is frustrating by constantly letting them play it out. And maybe just sitting down in the mud could be an interesting experience for the person.
It is a real image of psychic stuckness, isn't it? And I think a lot of people come into our offices and sort of feel this way, that they're in search of something and they keep on sort of running up the hill and then sliding right back down,
And the father has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I mean, there would be a lot of anxious energy wanting to perhaps transcend anxiety or the pain of that.
Because and sort of stay in an anxious running place rather than perhaps dropping into grief.
Yes, which is muddy and cold and problematic.
I don't know where you're getting the mud from, because it does say it's a desert, but
I don't know why when I think about them, this is in my fantasy, when I think about them slipping to the bottom, and I think in my own history of slipping down places, I always think of them slick and muddy. You're
Well,
absolutely right. It may not be muddy at all.
but it's very interesting that you've said that twice, because
Yeah.
how do we get mud? Well, through moisture or rain, and that would be the solutio of perhaps a grief and something more moistening coming into the psyche, rather than all this dry desert-like terrain. And moisture and rain is often equated with feeling, more feeling instead of the fear, because she feels danger behind her. So I like the image of what happens if she stops running and turns around and looks at what she thinks is pursuing her.
It's a real. Does she say that she's being pursued?
We don't
She
know.
says feeling danger behind. So I assumed, maybe incorrectly, that something feels like it's pursuing her.
Yep.
And this idea of transcending into abstractions as a way of trying to move above our anxieties, which is a reasonable coping skill, by the way, taking a very broad philosophic attitude or relating it to mythology can allow us to exhale a little bit and to breathe easy for a moment, so I can understand the temporary need to transcend. But there's something down at the bottom or behind her that she needs to grab hold of.
That she's running from. And there is this image, it is an image of sort of psychic lack in a way, because it's a desert and she can't catch her breath. So.
And if we think about that, all of us have been at least in high school track, when you're running and you start getting out of breath, that the amount of exertion that you're applying and the body's ability to actually respond to that constructively is out of balance. There's too much panic, there's too much adrenaline, there's too much fleeing, and the system is telling her, we can't keep up with you. So if this was a client that came into the office, we might imagine that she needs a lot of containment, she needs a lot of support, she needs a holding environment psychologically where she could feel safe enough to actually experience herself and to believe that that experience is not going to annihilate her. So many people are afraid that the depth of their feeling will be toxic to them. How many times do we hear somebody say that if I don't want to start crying because I'll just never stop? Which is such a fiction, of course, but it tells us about how people fear their feelings. And
there's a desire to avoid feeling.
That's greatly rewarded in our culture. Also, it leads us into this whole kind of patriarchal context that, being highly emotional or allowing our feelings to be very present to ourselves or to other people is somehow diminishing. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. I'm also looking at the context, my personal health issues, not terminal. That's an interesting conjunction there.
That is.
So there's something that's very worrisome for her. And maybe because it's not terminal, she's not really justified, as you're saying, Joseph, that she's not justified to feel as concerned as she feels.
But one way or the other, I think illnesses, personal health issues, and her father's diagnosis of lung cancer does bring the issue of mortality into the psyche. What if is there? And when we say, it's like a not terminal, also implies that terminal is in the room, or in here. Its opposite has been constellated as well.
Yes.
And even being sick, particularly as we're aging, being sick is very humbling. And to be laid up in bed and to not be able to have our ego rally the machine, forward in life, it gives us a glimpse, of end of life. It forces us to to confront our limits. And one of the limits in the dream could be that she won't reach the top of the mountain, or whatever that fantasy is at the top of the mountain. And how do we orient to our limits? And there's a lot there that,
Yes.
that this person could be talking out, either with a dear friend or perhaps a therapist.
Yeah, all three of these dreams were very rich.
Yes, and I want to, I'm sure all of us here want to thank and applaud the dreamers who submitted their dreams and trusted us to care for them. We really
Exactly.
appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's been very present with us, that we feel connected. I think Lisa and Joseph and I, and today with you too, Dave, of what a powerful connection there is to people we don't know, but through their dreams and what comes through. And that keeps us so enlivened and challenged and humbled by what people can bring to us and offer us of their psyches, even if we don't ever see them.
And the generosity of people to share their psyches so freely. It's so kind of the listeners to
We're moved every time.
Oh, that's wonderful. You three embody I think what's important and best about psychotherapy, and what's so inviting about the Jungian approach, is that it's so steeped in the human condition, and a recognition of the mystery and the dilemma that we all confront and share.
Yes, and how we are all connected somehow.
Yeah.
And can connect.
Well, that's a good closing line for us here, Deb.
Okay.
I think that's a good wrap up, at least. It's a good wrap.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. It's been wonderful, and thanks for the trust that we mutually shared in entering into this place where we didn't know what was going to come up or where we would. And so that's kind of a bonding experience for us, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So carry on. I wish you great success with your podcast.
Thank you.
It fills an important niche out there in the world of conversations between human beings.
Okay. All right. Farewell,
Bye-bye.
Dave.